Welcome to what is number 15 in our series of reflection studies on the New Testament book of Ephesians. And if you're a regular, you'll know the drill by now, that if you really want to get the most out of these, I really would recommend that you go back to number 1 and work your way forward. But then again, if you're a regular, then you've probably already seen those. But anyway, if you're just joining us here, then you are more than welcome, and perhaps you can do that some other time. Some years ago, we were visited by a crime prevention officer. There'd been a spate of burglaries in the area, and the police were keen to help local residents protect themselves from becoming the next victim. And one of the recommendations that they made to us was to install some sensor lights. You probably know the ones that I mean. They kind of detect movement, and if they do, they flood the area with light. And the logic is pretty clear. Burglars like to work in the dark. They don't want to be seen. So your sensor light is a really easy way of deterring them. And it seemed like a good idea, so sure enough, we fitted a couple. Whether it worked or not, I don't know, but we were never burgled. But we also began to discover that those lights had another use, which was altogether different. It meant that when we arrived home at night, or if we needed to pop out in the dark, the area was immediately flooded with light, which was actually most welcome. You know, instead of foraging around for the right key or putting it in the lock upside down because you couldn't see it properly, you were suddenly bathed in light. Or for that matter, if we had visitors and they arrived, or you, as you were saying farewell, you did so surrounded by light. And I was reminded of those security lights when I looked at the verses from Ephesians that we are going to reflect on, because they too are about light. Now, I'm sure that the Apostle Paul was not seeking to offer home security advice when he wrote the book of Ephesians. But that kind of same dual reality comes out in what he has to say here. You see, our home security light always did the same job. It flooded the area with light. But it had two very different purposes. For those who were there for the purposes of good, those who belonged at my front door, those who had a good reason to be there and meant no harm, it was a positive and welcoming thing. But for those who did mean harm, those who had no right to be there, those who wanted to remain hidden and obscured, that sudden pool of light was distinctly unwelcome. And Paul makes exactly the same point in the words that we're going to read together in a few minutes. Those who mean harm don't like light. They prefer darkness. And those who are good are bathed in the light. So let's take a look at what he has to say as we read Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. For you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light, for the fruit of the light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes light. This is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine upon you." Now, of course, Paul is not talking here, as I've already said, about halogen security lights or any other kind of security light for that matter. He's talking about Jesus, the light of the world. He's talking about the light of truth on which our faith is founded. But the principle remains the same, summed up by verse 13. Everything exposed by the light becomes visible. And if that's something we want people to see, or if it's something that we want to see more clearly ourselves, then this is only to be welcomed. But if it's something we're ashamed of, something we'd rather be doing in secret, then yes, our human instinct would want it to remain hidden. Now, light is quite a prominent theme in our Christian narratives. You know, some of the earliest Old Testament prophecies, written hundreds of years earlier, speak of the coming of Jesus in the language of light. The most recognised of these is probably the words of the prophet Isaiah, recorded in chapter Verse 2 of chapter 9. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And we might note that some people translate that word deep darkness as the shadow of death, because the word used in the original Hebrew very much conveys that idea. And I mention that because it's one of the resonances with this final poetic stanza that Paul writes here. Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead. And while we're on that subject of resonances, it might be worth looking at another of those Old Testament references to the coming of Jesus, again from the prophet Isaiah, but this time in chapter 60, where he writes, Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. And as Paul was a well-educated Pharisee, these are words with which he is likely to have been familiar. But Jesus himself also picks up on this theme of light. In John's Gospel, chapter 8 and verse 12 to be precise, he announces, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. But here's the thing. Not only does Jesus say, I am the light of the world, but he applies the same designation to his followers. And this time we're digging into Matthew's Gospel, a section often called the Sermon on the Mount, where in chapter 5 and verse 14, he says, You are the light of the world, to those who are listening. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. So at one level, Paul isn't exactly telling us anything new here, or at least anything we couldn't figure out by reading another part of the Bible. And just for the sake of completeness, we may as well pick up on Jesus' words recorded in John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to one of Paul's Pharisee mates from the time. This is judgment, says Jesus. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest their works be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their works have been carried out in God. So Paul is focusing on Jesus, the light of the world, and he's pulling in stuff from the Old Testament prophets, the life and teaching of Jesus, and he's putting them all together here. But as is often the case in the book of Ephesians, he isn't just drawing all this stuff together so we can write it down and learn it and reproduce it in our next scripture knowledge quiz. Paul, so often in Ephesians, takes the big ideas of our faith, but constantly brings that challenge. How do these affect the way you live your life? How do you understand yourself, your priorities, your identity in the light of them? And I sense that that's so important. Very few of us are going to argue with the fact that Jesus is the light of the world. We're all likely to defend that truth by pointing to those Old Testament passages that describe and foretell the coming of Jesus centuries before he came. And we're likely to take a dim view of those who argue differently. But that's kind of the easy bit. The unavoidable question that Paul keeps asking us through Ephesians is, well, so what? Never mind defending this as your intellectual right. How does it affect the way you live? How does it shape the person you are? How does it inform your understanding of this world? So we're going to take a look at some of these practical implications in a moment. But this might also be a moment for you to just hit the pause button and maybe make sure you've got those connections so that you can see how what Paul has to say here is drawn from those other parts of the Bible that I've just outlined. So what? That's the blunt but important question that Paul invites us to consider here. But as ever, he couches it in positive terms, which might well be summarised by the words of verse 8. Live as children of the light. But what does that mean in practice? Well, we might notice that, first of all, it simply means to do all the things that we've already been talking about as we've worked our way through the earlier chapters. You may notice that verse 8 begins with the word for or because. So, in other words, here's the reason, says Paul, why I want you to act in all the ways that I've been outlining in these previous verses. Because you are a people of the light. And it's interesting to notice how he perhaps offers some explanation of those words of Jesus. Do you remember Matthew 5? You are the light of the world, he tells his disciples. Yet I am the light of the world is what he announces in John chapter 8. So which is it, you might reasonably ask, particularly if you were one of the disciples at the time? Are you the light of the world, or are we the light of the world? And Paul kind of answers that question, I think, in verse 8, when he says, you are light in the Lord. And I sense that what he's saying here is, you're not light because Jesus said so one afternoon during his earthly ministry. You're light because you're living in a loving, life-giving relationship with Jesus, both as individuals and as a community. When I was young, I used to have a luminous watch. I'm not sure if they even make them anymore, but the hands and the key points on the dial were made of a substance which would absorb the sunlight in the daytime, and then when it went dark it would give out a glow so that I could see what time it was. And that kind of strikes me as a helpful illustration that might help us understand what Paul is saying here. Being light, living as children of the light, begins with your relationship with Jesus, and it's fueled and enabled by that relationship. My watch didn't light up at night unless I'd let it absorb the sunlight in the daytime. Now, I'm pretty sure that they didn't have luminous watches at the time of St. Paul. But it seems that he's actually kind of saying the same thing. We might say that he's talking about our spiritual luminescence in verse 14, when he says everything that is illuminated becomes the light. And I think that's something that's just worth stopping to recognise. I don't know about you, but I haven't found every word and every idea in the previous chapters and verses that easy. I know that I don't always manage to live as I know I should as a follower of Jesus. And I'm all too aware of my shortcomings in that respect. And the danger is that as we become aware of those shortcomings, we either beat ourselves up by making ourselves try harder, or we give up. And I'll say a bit more of that about that later. But as I've often said in these reflections, Paul is offering us a different way of thinking here. These behaviours become more natural, not by simply beating yourself up to try harder, but by investing in those things that give rise to them naturally. And I would say that whatever we are struggling with as a Christian, whether that's something that's been clearly outlined in the previous verses of Ephesians, whether it's something that we're going to encounter in the next chapter or so, or whether it's something that doesn't appear here but we still know it's not quite what it should be in our lives, Paul points us back to our relationship with Jesus. Embrace the light, he says. Invest in your relationship. What was his prayer in chapter 3? I pray that you may appreciate the height, the depth, the length, the breadth of the love of God, and so grow more into the full measure of Christ. We become children of the light, not through following rules and regulations, not by simply committing to try harder and harder, but by allowing ourselves to be loved by Jesus and nurturing our own love for Jesus in the light of that. Yes, let these behaviours be a measure of your journey to fullness. But if you're falling short, invest in that relationship. Goodness, righteousness and truth, which are all things that I'm sure we all aspire to, are the fruit of the light, says Paul in verse 9. They're the outcome of that investment in that relationship that we have in Christ. So here's the first group of questions that you might want to consider. How is your relationship with Jesus right now? What are the things that enrich and deepen that relationship, and how can you make sure that you invest in them? What are the things that get in the way of your relationship with Jesus, and what can you do about that? And if you're looking at this as a group and you feel comfortable with it, maybe ask yourself how you can help each other to do that. But to return to the purpose of that, I also want to bring you back to my childhood luminous watch. How did it work? Well, it became light through being in the light. So as we invest in our relationship with Jesus, so we also become part of that light. We too are lights to the world. But what does that mean in practice? Well, first, it's a reminder of our call to be examples to our world, to be Christ's ambassadors, as Paul puts it on more than one occasion. You know, Paul's spoken a lot about the futility of some of the values and behaviours that define Ephesian society, and he was pretty blunt back in chapter 2 when he described his readers who were part of that society as once being dead in their trespasses and sins. And we hear an echo, albeit a positive echo of that, in verse 14 when he writes, "Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead." And perhaps a better way of understanding that idea of being dead, particularly in the here and now, is again to draw on something that he said previously. This time in verse 19 of chapter 4, when he talks about a society that has lost all sensitivity. You know, we often speak of something being dead when it is numb physically. And of course, Paul here is talking about a society that's become numb spiritually. People have become insensitive to the wrongs that are rampant in the society they live in. So if we are living as children of the light, then we are those who are called to be light in that society, in that darkness. But those whose lives might also shine light on some of the things that are wrong in society too. And I think there's quite a personal and pastoral dimension to this. You know, over the years, I've had the privilege of journeying with people who have found faith and begin their life as Christian disciples, and several of those people have come to me a few weeks into that journey and said, you know, Phil, I can't do this. I can't be a Christian because I'm beginning to realise what a terrible person I am. There's stuff in my life that I feel ashamed of. I'm not good enough to be a follower of Jesus. And to be honest, when people started to say that to me, I felt a bit troubled. You know, I was kind of thinking I can't be a very good pastor if people are wanting to give up on the discipleship journey a few weeks in. And then it struck me. This is not a sign that your Christian discipleship is failing. It's a sign that it's succeeding. It's a sign of the reality of your faith because you're walking in the light. And the light is shining on stuff that you didn't notice or didn't care about before. The light is doing its job. Light makes things visible, says Paul in verse 13. And that's important for us to remember if perhaps we're struggling, if we're recognising stuff that isn't right in our lives. Yet, of course, we want to put it right. But we don't need to feel bad about it because God is doing what God does, shedding the light on it. And let's remember that we are talking about a God who Paul has already described in the opening chapter as having lavish grace that he delights to pour upon us, of having endless grace and love, and so I could go on. So God makes these things visible so that God can help us know we are forgiven. But it also means that we are called and invited to call out those things that are wrong in our world. Things that shouldn't be happening, things that society has perhaps numbed itself to. And if we're going to do that with integrity, then we do have to be those who, again, as Paul puts it in the opening verse of this chapter, are imitators of Christ, examples of the light, to put it another way. And of course, we do need to do that in ways that don't just come across as judgmental or holier than thou. And again, as Paul has already reminded us in verse 2 of chapter 4, living as a children of light means being humble and gentle and patient and loving. But it's also about letting the light do its work. Now, this is not the first time that we've been led to think about the ills of society as we have worked our way through Ephesians. But what develops here is not just a call to resist and shun such things, to put them off, as Paul said in the previous chapter, but also, when it's appropriate, to call them out, to be a prophetic voice in our world, and to offer society a vision of something different. Not just shut ourselves off from them, but to be those who advocate for God's way, for the way of light So some questions that you might want to consider is, where do you see the light shining? And what is the light revealing? What are the things that we need to be speaking out against in our world as God's people? And as you reflect on those things, are the ways that we can take Paul's lead and not just speak out against what's wrong, but also offer a positive alternative? How can we model something different? And then finally, how can we build an environment of light? And this may be a moment to just take you back to that first image I offered as that of a security light. A light that is welcoming and attractive to those who have good reason to be there, but a light that is a deterrent to those who are intent on wrong and harm. You know, Paul has talked a lot already in this section about avoiding the wrong kind of partnerships and the wrong kind of talk, and he echoes that again in verse 11, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but as we've just considered, also expose them. So how do we maintain a community of light? And what does that look like? In the verses that follow, we're going to be particularly encouraged to think about that on a personal level, in terms of our home and our family and our working lives. But what about our life as a church community? If we are, as Jesus said, a city on a hill and a light on a stand, what do people see when they look at us? Is that a reflection of the light of which Paul speaks here? And are the steps that we can take to keep that light alive and to keep that light clear? To be seen as a community who truly do reflect the nature of Jesus into this world of darkness. But as you reflect on these things, remember that core message. This is not a catalogue of expectations, but an outline of the benefits of the relationship that we are invited to have with Jesus. Jesus, the light of the world.